When we think about political conflict, we usually picture clashes out on the streets, right? But there's another battle, a much bigger one, that's always being fought. It's a war for our minds. Today we're going to dive deep into that hidden conflict, using the incredible psychological analysis of Iraj Abedini to really explore the mental landscape of a nation in crisis.
It all really kicks off with a puzzle, a big one. Why on earth would a regime use such brutal, self-defeating violence against its own people? I mean, violence that does nothing but isolate it on the world stage. If you're looking at it from a purely political playbook, it just doesn't make any sense.
And then there's the second piece of the puzzle. Why would some opposition groups, before they even have a whiff of power, start attacking their own potential allies? It's like they're copying the very behavior they say they're fighting against. So, what is going on here?
Well, to get our heads around these paradoxes, we need a whole new lens. As the analyst Iraj Abedini puts it, fascism, before being a governmental program, is a socio-psychological structure. This right here, this is our key. We're not just looking at politics anymore. We're looking at a mindset, a psychological structure that can pop up on any side of a conflict.
Okay, so let's start by taking this psychological lens and pointing it squarely at the actions of the ruling regime. This is where we uncover something fascinating called the survival trap.
Now, what's really interesting is how this whole mindset was dragged out into the open. A huge turning point was the European Union's move to label the IRGC a terrorist organization. And this wasn't some random decision. The analysis makes it clear this was a direct result of the regime's own extreme violence. That move essentially forced their psychological hand right out into the open for everyone to see.
So what exactly is this survival trap? Well, it's a core belief deep inside an authoritarian system that any kind of retreat, any little concession is going to lead to a total and complete collapse. So from their point of view, extreme violence isn't some mistake or a tactical error. No, it's a strategic, calculated choice. It's the only one they think they have left.
You can really break this grim logic down into 3 steps. First, the regime feels an existential threat. I mean, its very survival is on the line. Second, backing down is just psychologically impossible. In their heads, giving an inch means total annihilation. And so that leads to step 3. Extreme, brutal violence becomes the only option left. It's a choice between killing or being completely eliminated.
And this brings us to what that violence really means. As the source says, violence is not their strongest tool. It is their last tool when they have no power left to persuade. Think about that. When a government has to resort to pure brutality, it's basically shouting from the rooftops that it's gone bankrupt. It has no ideas, no legitimacy, nothing left to convince anyone. This massive show of force is actually a huge sign of weakness.
All of this relentless violence leads to a truly horrifying phenomenon that Abedini calls the invisible massacre. Now, this doesn't mean the killing is secret. It's the exact opposite. The violence is so public, so constant, so repetitive, that it just loses its shock value for the rest of the world. It fades into background noise, and that is a double tragedy for the victims. Not only are they being killed, but they feel completely alone as the world just seems to move on.
So far, we've really been zeroed in on the psychology of the oppressor. But this is where the analysis takes a sharp and, honestly, pretty uncomfortable turn. It holds up a mirror to a faction of the opposition, and what it reveals are some startlingly similar psychological patterns.
Okay, so what does this new kind of fascism actually look like, psychologically speaking? It's not always about uniforms and marches. It's about leader worship, where the leader is a savior or a father figure, and any criticism is seen as treason. It's about constantly creating enemies, because you need an other to unify your own group through fear. It's about glorifying violence as a sign of strength and seeing empathy as weakness. It's about a deep, powerful nostalgia for a golden age that never really existed. And crucially, it's a deep hostility to critical thinking, because art, science, a free press, they all ask questions, and this mindset demands nothing but absolute obedience.
And just look at how this plays out. This comparison makes the authoritarian mirror concept crystal clear. The regime crushes all dissent with violence. This faction attacks any critic as a traitor. The regime demands total obedience to its leader. This faction demands total devotion to its own savior figure. Both of them are constantly creating enemies to hold on to power. It's the exact same psychological software, just running on different hardware.
So how does this even happen? How can a movement that's supposed to be about freedom start to look just like the thing it's fighting? The analysis gives us a powerful way to understand this, the ecosystem of fear. It's this toxic environment where a repressive regime and an authoritarian opposition, even though they're enemies, end up feeding off each other and making each other stronger.
Let's break down how this toxic ecosystem actually works. Step 1. The regime's brutality creates this massive vacuum of fear, hopelessness, and just raw anger. Step 2. That vacuum becomes the perfect breeding ground for an authoritarian opposition to take root and grow. Step 3. This faction then steps in and presents itself as the only strong savior that can end all the chaos. And what's the final tragic result? All the infighting they create fractures the broader opposition movement, which, and this is the craziest part, actually helps the original regime survive. Now, with all this talk of traps and toxic ecosystems, you might be thinking it all sounds pretty hopeless. But this is where the analysis pivots to its most powerful and, frankly, hopeful point. The biggest achievements of the recent uprising weren't political, they were profound psychological breakthroughs. And these victories were huge. First off, bam! The myth that the regime was permanent and unshakable was just shattered. Gone. Second, society as a whole broke through this learned helplessness, this paralyzing fear that had kept it in check for so long. Third, the illusion that the system could somehow be reformed from the inside was totally dismantled. But maybe the biggest win of all was that a clear line was drawn in the sand against all forms of authoritarianism, whether it's the current one or a potential future one.
And this leads to an absolutely brilliant insight from Abedini. In historic moments, knowing what you don't want is more important than rushing to an answer for what you do want. This is so important. Sometimes the most powerful victory you can have is just crystal clear rejection.
So, in the end, the greatest achievement wasn't about finding a new leader or a new 10-point plan. It was the birth of a new, shared understanding of what must be rejected. It was the collective decision to just say no to any form of authoritarian rule, no matter what flag it's waving or what slogans it's shouting. That is a foundational shift in a nation's psychology.
And this brings us to the final, crucial question that this whole analysis has been building towards. It's about moving from just resisting a disease to actually getting vaccinated against it.
Think about it. If we accept that the real prison isn't just a political system, but a psychological state, one built on submitting to power, being afraid of dissent, and always needing an enemy, then just changing the warden doesn't set you free. True freedom means tearing down the walls of that mental prison, the one that gets built inside our own minds and our own culture. And so we're left with this. How can a society actually vaccinate itself against this recurring cycle of authoritarian psychology? How do you break the pattern for good so that the desire for a strongman, the fear of critical thinking, and the glorification of violence just can't find fertile ground to grow in anymore? That is the ultimate challenge, and the answer is what will define the future.